Hello and happy Easter. I'm Pastor Ted Wilkinson, pastor at Bethany United Church of Christ, and you're watching this because unfortunately during our Easter service, a technical issue caused our video to cut out about 5 or 10 minutes into the service. So rather than just giving you sort of one hymn in the announcements, I thought I would come back and re-record my Easter sermon. I won't be singing any hymns for you, unfortunately, but I thought I'd come back and record our Easter sermon too. Those of you at home will have something to watch and something to join us in celebration and worship this Easter morning. I will start off with just a few announcements. I'd like to give a special thank you to anyone who donated to our Lenten activity for our Church World Services hygiene bags. We got a lot of donations, and we're going to make a big impact on a lot of people's lives who really need it. I'd also like to thank everyone who came here for our breakfast and our sunrise service and our Easter service. It was great to have so many people. The breakfast was wonderful. And if you'd like to come to a meal that we are sharing, on Pentecost, which is May 19th, we'll be having a lunch after Pentecost church service. So I hope you'll join us for that. And so without further ado, our reading today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. And they entered the tomb, and they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on the right side. And they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place that they laid him. Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and he will meet you there, just as he told you." So the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The word of the Lord. So today is Easter, the day where Christians around the world will celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and this particular Sunday morning. And if we lived in Jerusalem, the city where all this took place, but if we lived there today, we would of course want to celebrate, as all Christians around the world will today. And we would have many choices. It's obviously a very religious city. There's a lot of synagogues, a lot of mosques, a lot of churches. But one church we might want to join, or might want to go celebrate at, is a church called the Holy Sepulchre. And sepulchre means tomb, so that's the Church of the Holy Tomb. And it is a church where thousands of people, thousands of Christian pilgrims every Easter come to in order to visit the tomb of Jesus, because the church is built on what is some consider to be the tomb that Jesus' body was placed in on Good Friday and was taken out of on Easter Sunday, or was resurrected from on Easter Sunday. Early Christians did not mark down where the tomb was. We have no records of where specifically it was. But when Emperor Constantine took over the Roman Empire in the late 300s, around 400 AD, he was a Christian, so he decided that all these important places that Jesus and the apostles went should not just be marked down, but should have churches built on top of them. That was a very Roman way of thinking. The Romans and a lot of pagan pantheons would build worship sites and temples on the sites of important places. And so he didn't himself go to Israel, I don't believe, but he sent people in his stead to locate these places and to build churches on them so that they could be remembered. One of these places was the tomb of Jesus. And the people he sent went to Jerusalem, and they asked the locals where was Jesus' tomb, and they sort of had an idea, and they told them where they believed it was, and so Constantine ordered a church to be built, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has existed there for since the year 400 until today. In some form, it's obviously is not the same building. It had been knocked down a few times, whether from a conquest of Jerusalem or from multiple earthquakes apparently knocked it down. But if you go there on an Easter now, it is a big cathedral, and it's run by several denominations: the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Coptic Church, which is the Christian Church of Egypt. All sort of share in the running of this important cathedral. And it's very ornate, and it's very Catholic and Orthodox in its style. There are gigantic frescoes of different aspects of Jesus's life. It's in all the paintings are in sort of the Greek Orthodox style you might recognize. Incense is always burning. There's chanting and monks praying all the time. And if you were to go on Easter Sunday with thousands of others, it would of course be very crowded, but you would take turns going into the former tomb, which is now a shrine called the Edicule. And this is the shrine where, sort of in the middle of the church, that surrounds where Jesus was supposedly buried. So every Easter, thousands of pilgrims come to this church to celebrate and to take part in an Easter Mass and go down into the Edicule and go in there just as Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome did 2,000 years ago, go into this tomb. But if you were to go to that worship service and you were to sing and pray and take communion, and then the service ended and everyone goes out, maybe you decide to take a walk. And if you were to take a walk for about a mile north of the church, you may come across an area that's very different. It's sort of on a rocky hill, and there's a lot of green grass. It looks kind of like a garden that's almost been untouched. And you would probably find on Easter Sunday a praise band, a Christian sort of modern day praise band, and lots of people celebrating around another tomb of Jesus Christ. Because within a mile of the Holy Sepulchre, there is another tomb called the Garden Tomb, which is also believed to be the tomb where Jesus' body was buried. Now, the reason that there are two different locations, the two different tombs of Jesus, we've already talked about the Holy Sepulchre, but the Garden Tomb comes about because of the work of two men who journeyed to Israel themselves and wanted to find Jesus' tomb. And these men lived in the 1800s. Christians have been traveling and pilgriming to Jerusalem as long as our faith has existed. But a big boom of pilgrimage, especially from Western Europe, started in the early 1800s when modes of travel such as the railroad and steamship helped make the journey a lot easier and a lot faster, and friendlier relations with the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Israel at the time, allowed for a lot more tourism and a lot easier travel. So a lot of Christians, specifically Protestants, who had not had a lot of connection with the Holy Land before, began to travel there. And a lot of clergy and scholars of Protestantism began to travel to Israel to find these famous locations that they read in their Bible. They wanted to discover them for themselves. And one of these Christians was an English scholar named Edward Robinson. And Robinson went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He went to find all these locations, and he felt that it couldn't be Jesus' tomb because he thought that church, the Holy Sepulchre, would have been outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem. There's some debate about whether that was true, but he felt it couldn't be there. So he said it should be somewhere else. And people and Protestants had a lot of feelings like this. Some believe that it was simply because they went to the Holy Sepulchre and they didn't recognize what they would envision to be Jesus's tomb. We obviously, when we think about it, we see maybe something from a movie or a TV show where it's sort of a tomb carved into the side of a mountain or a hill, and it's very grassy and very untouched, and not a lot of people are there. And obviously, a little shrine inside a cathedral is not what they were picturing. So perhaps Perhaps they had a point on the location couldn't possibly be it, but perhaps also they simply wanted to find an untouched tomb. They wanted to be the first to discover it. And so him and a lot of Protestants began looking around Jerusalem for locations that Jesus' tomb could be. And one location they came up upon was a limestone hill about a mile away from the Holy Sepulchre, which some believed looked kind of like a skull. If you looked at the mountain the right way or the hill the right way, it kind of looked like a skull, and Jesus was crucified on an area called the Skull. So they thought maybe he was crucified here and then buried underneath. And this limestone hill was also had a bunch of tombs in it that were carved into the limestone from all areas, from 800 BC all the way up to the medieval era. So there were plenty of tombs to look at and explore and speculate on. And that's where another man, the second man in our story, the British general named Charles Gordon, comes in. Now, Charles Gordon was he was a general for the British Army, and he was a very successful general. He had had several successful campaigns in China. He had been the governor of Sudan for a time, and he was a celebrity sort of in England. Everyone knew who he was because of his dedication to the British Army. And in 1883, on sort of a sabbatical from being a general, he traveled to Jerusalem and sort of followed other Protestants in searching for the tombs, and he also felt that it must be on this limestone hill. It must have been the location of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. And for a reason that no one is quite clear on, he never wrote down the specifics of why he chose, but unlike the others, he chose a specific tomb. He said, this tomb must be the tomb that Jesus was buried in. And because of his celebrity in England, a lot more gravitas was given to it, and a lot more people paid attention. It was one thing when sort of scholars and seminaries were talking about, oh, where's the actual tomb? What does it look like? It was very different when a full-fledged sort of celebrity gave credence to it. And so a lot more Protestants, specifically English Protestants, took notice of when Gordon said this, and they began coming there on Easter Sunday. When they would come to Jerusalem, they wouldn't go to the Holy Sepulchre anymore. They would now go to what became known as the Garden Tomb. And in fact, a few years after Gordon had visited the spot, a nonprofit called the Garden Tomb Association purchased the land around it, and they still operate to this day. It's a nonprofit that specifically just holds the land because they believe it is Jesus' burial tomb. Now, this belief in the Garden Tomb versus the Holy Sepulchre is very much split down denominational lines. Catholics and Orthodox Christians still believe the Holy Sepulchre. Protestants are more likely to believe in the Garden Tomb. But most scholars today question whether either is the actual tomb of Jesus, because no one thought to mark it down right after Jesus' resurrection. And scholars don't just question if either of these particular two locations are the tomb, but whether we'll ever actually know, because so few details were handed down to us in the Gospels. We know that where Jesus was crucified on a hill called the Skull, but we don't know. It just says he was buried in a tomb nearby. That gives a lot of area to cover. And thousands of years later, we still are not 100% sure, despite some people's belief in one location or another. But still, despite not knowing specifically where it was, despite the fact that it could have been any of these tombs on a hill of limestone or near the Holy Sepulchre, thousands of people still come to both locations to worship Easter Sunday and the resurrection of Jesus in Jerusalem. But I think it's important to remember that early Christians never bothered to mark down where Jesus had been buried, because I think they realized, even in that early stage of their belief in theology, in the early stage of our faith, they realized something that Gordon and Robinson maybe didn't, which is that it doesn't matter where Jesus was buried, because his story didn't end in a tomb. See, early Christians, we have records of them going to other people's graves. They would go to Christian martyrs' graves. They would go to saints' graves. And they would sometimes do worship service. Sometimes this was because they wanted to avoid persecution, but sometimes it was sort of to venerate a saint or an important person in the church. But no one has ever given any or shown any evidence or any written account of Christians coming to Jesus's tomb. And I think it's because, unlike these saints and martyrs who are spiritually and their soul is with God now in heaven, their bodies are still very much in their graves. Jesus left his tomb, body and all. He walked out, he was gone by the time the Marys and Salome got there. And Jesus never came back. In fact, the apostles never came back to his tomb. We have the story of Mary, the mother of James, and Salome coming to the tomb, and then they leave, and then we have a story of Peter and another disciple hearing what they have to say and coming to the tomb to check for themselves. But after that, the disciples never come back. They never come back. They never build a shrine there, and they never even thought to write down where the tomb was. Because to them, it was just a place Jesus had been for a moment, been temporarily, but had left and never come back to. No different than the well where Jesus had rested at and talked to a Samaritan woman, or the bed he slept on in the town of Bethany. No one had thought to grab the bed and take it to Jerusalem and make a shrine to it. No one had thought to build a church around the well when he talked to the Samaritan woman. Because these were just places. They weren't, to the apostles, they weren't important. Because what was important was Jesus and his message. Because the story of Easter was never the story of an empty tomb, but the story is Christ's triumph over death and what that means for us. Today's reading that I started this sermon with comes from the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel we have read throughout Lent. We have followed Mark through Jesus' journey in life and his ministry. And this will be the last reading that we have from Mark during this period, because these are the last lines of his Gospel. Mark ends his Gospel on sort of a cliffhanger, an anticlimax. The women who have thought Jesus was dead come to the tomb and find not his body to prepare for a proper burial, but instead an angel who tells them that Christ is risen. He is not here with the dead, and that he will meet them in Galilee. But in Mark's story, we never meet the risen Jesus. We never meet anyone but this angel. Jesus, we assume, meets the apostles in Galilee, but if we only had Mark's account, we would never know. In fact, this ending felt so anticlimactic that Christians who would copy the Gospels so that they could give them to other churches, years after Mark's death, began adding endings onto Mark's Gospel, mostly copied from the Gospel of Matthew. But they felt it was just such a dud ending that they felt like they had to give it a little oomph, a little extra. You'll probably see if you open your Bible that there's what's called a short ending of Mark and a long ending of Mark. And the long ending is usually noted to probably not be original to Mark's actual gospel, and that the actual gospel ends at verse 8. And a lot of people have argued about why Mark chose to do this. Some think maybe he just wanted to write down an account of Jesus' life and ministry, so that future generations, maybe him and the apostles were getting older, and so future generations would have this account. Some have argued that maybe in his day, Christians had become far too focused on the resurrected Jesus and were forgetting Jesus' life and ministry, and he wanted to remind them that Jesus' teachings and his life before his resurrection were also important. And some think that maybe he had written a companion book to this, sort of like Luke wrote his gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, that Mark had a life of Jesus and sort of a resurrection of Jesus, a collection of stories of Jesus' resurrection, and for some reason that book is lost to us. But whatever the case, Personally, I think that this ending, as abrupt as it is a great expression of that first Easter. Because we Christians today, separated by 2,000 years from the woman who arrived at the tomb on that first Easter morning, we know the story already. We know its twists and turns. We might forget some of the details occasionally, but we know where it's going. We are not surprised when the women arrive at the tomb and the boulder is pushed aside. We are not shocked or frightened when there is an angel in the tomb who greets them. We are not astonished or unable to conceive what it means when the angel tells them that Christ is risen. We know what is coming when we read this story. But the followers of Jesus who lived it, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, those three brave apostles who walked to Jesus' tomb to prepare his body, to give him one last act of service, one last thank you to a man that had meant so much to them, they didn't know what was coming. That march to the tomb was not a march of triumph. It was a solemn and sad affair. Though in time they would see that Jesus had been telling them throughout his ministry and his life that he would come back, that he was giving them clues about what would happen in the future, at the time they did not recognize them. And so at the time it was a very different story. Their experience of Easter is very different to ours. It is only in time that they came to understand it. Only in time that they came to see not just the resurrection, but Jesus' death on the cross. Not as a defeat, not as a humiliation, but as a triumph, as a victory. I think that speaks to the importance of the resurrection, why Easter, though maybe Christmas gets a little more attention, I think Easter is the most important holiday in our calendar. Because without the resurrection, our faith is not here. I think Jesus' teachings are sound advice and sound ideas, no matter what religion you are, but without the resurrection, I don't think his message spreads. I think that him and his disciples are a footnote in Jewish theological history about a peasant farmer from Galilee who made some waves back around 30 or so AD and then was crucified by the Romans. It is only because of the resurrection that we remember all of these stories. Because it is only through the resurrection that his followers found the bravery and the strength to continue his work. Let's remember that before this point, when Jesus was arrested, his followers mostly abandoned him. Even his leader, Peter, denies him 3 times. Only a handful, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome, they are the only ones. And a handful of others, it says in the gospel. They're the only ones that stay with Jesus, even though they can't be directly with him. They stay through his trial, and they stay through his execution, and they are the only ones brave enough to come to his tomb on this Sunday morning. Had Jesus not come back, Peter and the other apostles may have just gone back to Galilee and tried to forget. But his resurrection gives them hope. And it gives them a faith in something that cannot be shaken. Jesus will spend time with them as the resurrected Lord, and then will ascend into heaven. And after that point, his disciples will return to Jerusalem, preaching not just the message that Jesus had preached his whole life, but a new message, that the resurrection of Jesus has come, that their Lord, that the high priest had betrayed in a sham trial, that the Romans had nailed to a cross and killed is alive again. This would come to infuriate and anger the high priest and the Roman authorities because they had already killed Jesus. They thought that would be the end of this movement. How do you kill someone? How do you crucify someone you've already killed? It infuriated them. And most of the apostles will go on to have their own horrible deaths, unfortunately, as they spread the gospel, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Israel, but around the world. The people who killed Jesus will try and kill his message, but they can't. Thanks to the resurrection, Christ's message became unkillable, as his followers came to learn that death is not the end. Because the story of Jesus does not end in a tomb, like his followers had feared that day. It continues on past the time of his resurrection, on past the ascension, all the way to today. Jesus' story continues. The message of Easter is that the tomb cannot contain the power of God. That death cannot stop God's love for humanity. Easter and the empty tomb are proof that God will always be triumphant. That our faith in God and Christ will always be rewarded. And that the tomb isn't the end, but is the beginning of something amazing. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me here today. Happy Easter. He is risen. Amen.